Welcome to the Strong Youth Project, where our mission is to improve organized sport experiences for youth, parents, coaches, and other mentors via education and evidence-based practice.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jenae Nelson. I'm in the psychology department here at BYU and with the Strong Youth Project. I'm here today to interview a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. John B. White from Baylor University. John B. White holds a PhD in moral theology, Christian ethics, from the University of Edinburgh in the UK. He is the Harold and Dottie Riley Professor of Practical Theology and Ethics and Director of the Sports Chaplaincy Program at Baylor University's George W. Truett Theological Seminary. He received a grant from Lilly Endowment in 2015 as the principal investigator to establish the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor University, which is really cool. That's really exciting. So we're very grateful that you're here with us today and excited to learn from you. John's been working in the faith and sport integration for a very long time and has a lot to teach us. So I'm just going to start off with a question that I think that a lot of people will have, especially those that will be listening to this. Why does character in sport matter? And in other words, why can't people just get character formation from church, for example?
Well, one, that's a really good question. I think first we need to understand that human beings are fundamentally moral in nature. So whenever you talk about a human being or their moral agency, it's always wherever they go. So you can't go into any sphere or slice of life and not have your moral nature present. And so one of the first things to recognize for sports is one of the most sport is one of the most hyper-intensive domains of life. I mean, all the emotions are present there, highs and lows. And we really want to make sure that people, when they step into that, whether it's youth all the way to professionals, or coaches, of course, and families and parents, that they recognize that what's happening in sports is forming your character, whether you're cognizant of it or not. And so why it matters to understand ethics in sports, not only in church, is because sometimes Christians have kind of separated or compartmentalized those two areas. So they may learn ethics in church, but they don't know how that translates to ethics in sports. And so you can learn a lot in church. In fact, that should be the primary place that I would argue you are formed morally, but they don't know how it applies to sports. And so when we step into sports, there's just so many opportunities to see it more as a school or a crucible for forming us as moral agents. And if we're not prepared for that, we might be saying and doing things in there that would be diametrically opposed, or it would not be congruent to the ways that we act in church. And so we want to bring those two worlds together, and they ought to be mutually informing one another. And even the intensity and the practices that you find in sports can actually inform your devotion and dedication to excellence in church.
When you talk about sport being a school, I'm curious if you think that there are specific character traits that are like uniquely formed in sports, that are best formed in sports.
Yeah, that's a good question, too. I typically want to start with the fact that as Christians, there's some fundamental virtues that we want to display in any area. So faith, hope, and love. And so we have that grant. We received that grant. It's expired now, but it went from 2015 to 2023. And we bring high school athletes in for about a week, and they go through this curriculum that consists of talks as well as these sport virtue labs. And we try to teach them how to think about faith. Whether you believe in God or not, you're trusting in something or someone, and these are Christian athletes, so we want them to recognize that their primary audience is God. We use some phrases and language from other groups that my wife and I used to work with. We call it audience of one. Now, real quickly, when we think about audience of one, we recognize that in a stadium there's multiple audiences. So it's not like you don't care about your family or your peers or your significant others or your friends, but we want to make sure all those audiences are subordinate to the ultimate audience, that God is the one we want to please more in sports. And so that would be a virtue that we would want to help cultivate in young people so they come into sports and recognize that this is a place of worship and trusting God just as it is in church. And then we would talk about hope and love, and then the cardinal virtues of courage and self-discipline and even justice. How we treat one another is a matter of justice. Now, when I think about those virtues, it seems like a couple of those are accentuated in sports. For example, like courage and self-control. Sports seems to be a place that can be, like I said, a school. And Plato talked about this. Plato talked about that the two primary ways that young people should be educated are gymnastics, which he meant sports, and music. And so the souls of young people need to be formed in such a way in sports that it be consistent with their other Christian values and ideals.
That's really great. So I'm thinking as a developmental psychologist here and thinking about all the different skills that would be involved in those things that you were talking about. And like when you were talking about discipline, I'm thinking about self-regulation and all these other things that are coming online. Are there anything, I mean, of course we can instantly recall to mind some ways that sports goes wrong, but can you talk about some of the vices that we need to be cautious about in sport?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that all the 7 deadly sins are on display in sports. So if one of the first sins of humans, Adam and Eve, was pride. We see pride on display regularly in sports. So it's this excessive love for one's own good at the expense of other people's good, where you just have this inordinate affection for yourself excelling. And so we would refer to that even like self-glorification. I don't think I would ever want to just glorify myself, right? There's nothing wrong with praising and encouraging one another, but the ultimate goal is to strive for excellence in relation to God, that he would be glorified there. And a great line is that God is most fully glorified when men or women are fully alive. And so we want to see agency and freedom at work in sports. And it's not closed down, they're not encumbered. I think a lot of athletes just get almost like mentally incarcerated, right, because of fear, shame, and guilt that sometimes coaches can put on them. So if they can come into sports with a greater sense of freedom, then I don't think they resort to the vices. At least they're pointing in a direction where I think it can minimize that they would want to try to cope with the challenges of sport by resorting to the vices. And I was just thinking of a study that came out, it's actually dated a bit, but it was 72,000 athletes over 17 years. And they were looking at the difference between athletes' moral reasoning and non-athletes' moral reasoning. And athletes performed worse than non-athletes in every area. And one particular area was that the longer you play sports and the higher the level of competition, the more morally callous that you become. So this is when people say that sports builds character. I'd say, well, it can. That's the operative word. It can build character. But in the same way, you could just go to the church or to the temple or your place of worship. And just because you go there doesn't mean you're going to become more godly. It's about perspective. It's about attitude. And are you cultivating faith? Are you cultivating hope? And your commitment to God. And so then this is a place that could strengthen that. But just by going and showing up at a place, that in and of itself doesn't strengthen your character.
Talked about increasing agency, freedom for the athletes to help avoid those. Can you talk a little bit more about how you would create more agency or freedom for the athletes?
Well, I think especially for young athletes, we need to return sport back to them, empower them. Too often, families, right, parents, are trying to live out vicariously through their children. So that's just a lot of pressure, and a young person doesn't have the freedom to kind of fail, make mistakes. Making mistakes and failure is a part of their Christian journey, a part of the human, odyssey. And so we want to allow them to learn how to negotiate and navigate and discern right from wrong. But if they're always feeling that they're going to get scolded or shamed, then they're oftentimes going to do just what the coach or parent wants. And sometimes that can work really well, but a lot of times that's just managing outward behavior, and it's not learning to internalize the character traits that give more freedom, right? Perfect love casts out all fear. So if people are really loved well in sports, then I think their agency increases exponentially. This is where I would encourage parents as well as coaches, look for different ways to implement character or moral formation in sports. So oftentimes, I understand why there's this pressure, but it's all about the X's and O's. So a guy named Joe Ehrman wrote a book called Inside Out Coaching, and he says we need to understand the whys behind the X's and O's. He asks a question: what kind of coach would you like to have coach you? And one of the things he has coaches explore is their own personal narrative and how might they be coaching in a way that's actually detrimental and destructive, and would you want to be under that kind of coaching model? And so by doing more of that kind of, deeper self-work, it hopefully frees up coaches to then see their athletes as young people that are morally developing. So you don't want to put them in situations that's going to compromise their character. So look for ways, this is where I'm trying to make a long story hopefully shorter, look for ways where you can implement practices. Like, for example, if a young athlete or high school or college athlete gets angry, instead of shutting down that anger, how could we explore that strategically in a way that they don't feel called out, maybe on the side or even with the group, or do it as a moral lesson in the future, but where they can understand how to self-regulate, giving them some resources and tools, because what you do in sport, if it's done well, should translate into other areas of life.
And I tend to agree with that you do see, and the research is saying the same thing, that these skills are transferable and that what you learn in sport you can carry into other domains of your life. But it's interesting that we're not quite intentional with teaching these things with our youth. And it seems even people who are really buying into character development don't seem to think about it in sport. Why do you think that is?
Probably, and I want to always believe the best about people, but they spend so much time focusing on strategy and technique that they haven't done the deeper kind of work or learned how to be moral educators. And we're always morally educating each other all the time, whether we're good role models or bad role models, but having time to make this a part of the coaching curriculum. A lot of coaches go get certified and get the training, but this is not a part of the training. And so instead of apologizing for it, let's figure out ways to strengthen the coach's character so that they can become more impactful. And research does show that the impact of a coach is significant on the physical and social development of young people, not just in a single game or season, but in ways that go way beyond the game. So I think of even anecdotally some coaches in my life. A guy named Chris Katowski, he would have a part of our team meetings, books and articles that we'd have to read, and we would discuss that. Now, recognizing we didn't spend as much time doing that as we did as far as strategy and techniques and working on form and that kind of stuff. I was a cyclist, but he made it still a part of our meetings, and so it made us more thoughtful, and we started to learn to think about character not only in terms of the right actions, but the kind of people that we wanted to become, and learning to do it in the right way at the right time. Just
kind of back to that very first question, like what do you think is actually at stake here if we don't teach character? We talked about the deadly sins, but what is at stake?
Well, I think three areas. One is compartmentalization, that the faith only pertains or matters in more spiritual settings and the church and that kind of stuff, and recognize that you spend more time outside of the church than you do inside of the church. So that means there's huge swaths of life that have not been brought under really the lordship of God, and so we're not thinking critically and constructively about how to live, how to be good and do good in those areas. So we bifurcate reality, right? And so we kind of separate those. The other one would be some kind of syncretism, where we get co-opted by the ideologies of the world. Instead of renewing our minds, we conform to get squeezed into the molds of the world. And Paul says in Romans 12:1 and 2, when that happens, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to discern God's good, perfect, and acceptable will. And thirdly, related to that, is that you'll live a more diminished life. You won't live the fullness of life, as we talk about agency and the freedom that we're called to as Christians.
And with that diminished life, we also see this in the literature, that a lot of athletes, especially as you're saying, the more, the higher they get, and the better they get, the more mental health issues they have, and you see higher rates of depression, anxiety, and that's confusing. That makes me want to scratch my head. What's going on? Why is this happening? If anything, as they're getting better and better, shouldn't they be happier and happier? Especially the way that we talk about sport and winning, and if you're winning more, shouldn't you be happy more? So, but that's not happening, and I think that's potentially speaking to what you're saying, that these things are happening, so people are not happy even when they win.
Absolutely. I think it's because when we think about what it means to be a human being, we're not just physical beings. We're more than animals. Aristotle would say we're rational animals. I would say as Christians, we're worshiping animals, right? So there's always this duality, right? Where we recognize that we're human, and we have a lot in common with other animals, right? But we also have a higher state that we're supposed to live by. And so if we're only living towards physical excellence, we're neglecting other dimensions of our humanity. So I would talk about moral excellence and spiritual excellence. And for an athlete to really, I would argue, to excel and glorify God, they need to be striving for excellence in all three areas. In literature, they talk about two problems: a bracketed morality and game reasoning. Game reasoning is a form of cultural relativism, where in Rome, do as the Romans do; in sports, do as sports persons do. Instead of thinking critically about right and wrong, we just simply agree with the values and norms of sports and not recognizing that it is not a perfect match or map onto the kingdom of God. There's so much good and beauty in sports, but if we understand the power of the fall, it's been narrated in sports, and people are broken, and they can live disintegrated and distorted lives. So if you get co-opted into that mindset, then you're going to end up justifying your actions because you'll say it's relative to sports. And people even say things like they're Dr. Jekyll outside of sports, but Mr. Hyde in sports. That they actually change their personalities because that's what's expected of them to win, and that's then some kind of winning at all cost. And the bracket of morality happens because sports, by definition, is a set aside, a separate element of life. I often jokingly say you can steal bases in baseball, but if you were to steal something outside of baseball, you're going to get arrested for it. And so there is a justification that there's a difference between sports and everyday life, but at the same time, when one buys into that in a way that that's not healthy, then they may bracket the morality as Christians, and they won't think about how this translates to every area of life.
I think about how a lot of Latter-day Saints, but particularly the audience that's going to be listening to this, think we've got character covered at church. We're doing that really well, and so that's where we do all of our moral formation. We talked about this earlier in our first question, but then the bracketed morality. Now we're on the field; things are different. There's different rules, and so that's interesting.
Well, let me say one thing too.
Yeah,
what would it look like if in church, services, that these areas would be talked about as far as applications of the faith? And so I think that'd be another way that we could form young people, that they begin to see the church cares about this. And I would say that the church should care about it because God cares about it. We're human beings, and He wants to see us to do well. God's not looking at us to fail, right? And so our striving to do well is something the church ought to be concerned about. And so that doesn't mean you have lengthy sermon series or whatever on sports, but it could be like the little points of anecdotes and stories and illustrations that show how the kingdom of God, how the church connects to everyday life. So Sunday makes a difference from Monday through Saturday.
One of the things that we talked about earlier today when we met was this idea that a lot of people think about competition as being a bad thing. It just isn't. So maybe these things are diametrically opposed, that you can't have sport and be moral in sport because just by the very nature of it's competitive, it's filled with pride. Specifically, there's a prophet, President Benson, who said that that pride is competitive by nature. And so we automatically tend to think about competition as being this bad thing. So speak to us about why that might be a problematic way to think about competition, and how can we think better about it?
Well, I would say I would agree with, is it Benson you said? Mm-hmm. I would agree with what he's claiming there, that pride is kind of parasitic on competition. In the same way that a cavity is parasitic on a tooth, right? Rust ruins iron. But iron isn't necessarily rust, and competition isn't necessarily prideful. I think those are always encroaching on sports because we have all these other pressures from the media, from the other stakeholders and power brokers. But at the same time, sports can be a place where you can resist pride. I mean, here's a controlled environment where you can teach young people to have respect and be other regarding instead of only be egocentric. And egocentric can be true in any area of life. So I would argue if somehow competition is by definition prideful, tell me a realm of life where competition doesn't exist. And I'd say if that's true, then Christians can't compete at all in business, in medicine, in law. And so I think we need to take a step back and say, okay, we recognize these vices are surrounding it. We're susceptible to those kinds of things, but we don't have to necessarily be prideful, that we can be trusting. We can recognize that we need the other. And earlier in our day, we were talking about competition, as you indicated, Jenae. Competition, historically or etymologically, has been defined as a mutual quest towards excellence. Competition is derived from the Latin word competitio. Com meaning with, petitio means to question or to strive. And I think a healthy understanding of competition is this mutual striving towards excellence. In any realm we find ourselves in, when we want to strive together with people to achieve goodness, truth, and beauty. And I think those are the goods that are readily available for anyone in sports, even if you lose. And I would argue that losing is an opportunity to grow in your faith. That doesn't mean we aspire to lose. In fact, the game is designed to win, but not everyone's going to win. So how do you make theologically sense of losing? And I think we need to help young people to learn how to do that.
Going back to your comment about freedom, I think also, we know that Americans in particular have a really hard time with negative emotion, and we have an inclination to kind of suppress negative emotion and reward positive emotion, seek positive emotion because it feels good. But within that line of thinking, you can, try to downplay any negative feelings that you may have, but freeing them up to be disappointed, freeing them up to accept the failures in a healthy way. So how would you go about doing that as a parent or a coach? How would you help an athlete work through some of these negative experiences in a virtuous way?
That's a great question. One of the things I think I would do is ride home after a game. I think one of the first questions we should be asking are not outcome or product questions, right? Or more process questions. And so allowing a young person to be sad, right? I think it's a misrepresentation of the feelings that come with loss if you just discount that or say, hey, Jesus has got you, or everything is good, God loves you. Well, that's true, but at the same time, we've lost. And so by having them learn to sit in loss and be able to name how it feels, where they're frustrated and all the other attendant emotions that are around loss, and learning to even grieve in some ways, right? We're all going to have loss, and learning to mourn, lament, and to grieve are part of the Christian resources to make sense of failure and loss.
But I also wonder if we're making the negative experiences worse by the way that we pressure them. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, if one doesn't feel that they can talk about it and they feel there's some kind of stigma associated with loss, then they're going to do everything they can not to lose. And I think that's setting people up then to resort to win at all costs, cheating, employing strategies that are against the very nature of competition and are harmful to the opponent, the co-contestant, as well as to the person who's choosing to do something that's destructive.
And that brings up a really great question here, is that I know a lot of people have, which is that, is winning and character development, are they in competition with each other, or are they opposing each other? Like, can you do both?
Yeah, I think so. They're not mutually exclusive. If we go back to the definition, if it's a mutual striving towards excellence, then in my pursuit of winning, I also want you to achieve excellence. We know at the end of the game we both can if we're competing against each other. And so how do I help you to develop and you help me to develop in such a way that's consistent with the rules of the game? And so if I see you have some weaknesses in your game, whatever the sport is, it would only seem right that I would identify those if I'm thinking about as a mutual quest, so that you are strengthened in your own striving for spiritual, moral, and physical excellence. However, if I think it's all about me, then I'm not going to help you, and I'm going to try to exploit that and dominate you. In fact, I would go so far, this is radical. You see this in instances of this in past Olympics and in games, when an opponent actually compliments during the game, like a tennis match or something like that, or after a game may go point out some things that they can improve to make them better. And so it just starts to bring the humanity, and we so easily dehumanize sports, so this is a place to elevate the humanity, to dignify the competition as well as the people who are playing the sports.
How do we get this out to people? How do we tell them? How do we train them? How do we get this information into the hands of the athletes? So, kind of pivoting to my next question is, what role do parents, coaches, what have you? What role do they play in all of this? And then, how do you think that we can start educating to this better way of thinking about competition?
So I think the first thing we want to look to is that are parents in agreement with this? Are they buying into this? Because it's so easy to kind of see sports for its instrumental value, for its extrinsic goods, that I can play sports to get a scholarship, which we already know the percentage of people that are going to go from high school to college to professional level is minuscule, right? So you're setting yourself up for failure if you think that's the primary reason for you playing sports. And so getting them to buy in and having coaches and parents at the beginning of seasons, we're talking more youth sports and high school, to have a sit down and have some kind of covenant agreement that these are our code of ethics. This is what we're going to be about, whether we win or lose. Yes, our objective is to try to win, but how can we do it in such a way where we're helping people to be good and to do good? And I think a practical way would be, what are some habit-forming practices? If virtue is about being dedicated to excellence and committed to excellence, and then it's going to require practice in order to flourish. And so having this to be a part of a typical game strategy or practice strategy, where you talk about stories of great athletes that can inspire them to want to do well and to treat the opponent with respect and dignity.
Also wondering, because you talked a lot about faith and faith integration. So what role do you think religion has in character formation in sport? Does it have a role?
Absolutely. I would say there should be no separation between faith and character. In fact, at some level, as soon as you start claiming that something is good or bad, there needs to be some standard or reference. Is it going to be some immanent or earthly reference? Well, how are we able to judge what is right and wrong without some transcendent source to help us to discern that? Because if we are broken and fallen people, then we're trapped in the very problem that we're trying to discern whether this is right or wrong. So we need something from without to tell us what is right and wrong. And so the beauty of the Christian faith is that we have revelation. We have in the LDS, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and then you have the Bible, the Scriptures. And so collectively, as well as other religious traditions, right, you can discern right from wrong because they're claiming that they're sources of revelation of right and wrong.
Some of the things that you brought up about the moral bracketing and this separation that we do, you can see how that happens. You think, I've already got this covered, so I don't need to do it here. But you're making a very good case for why we should care about it in sport. I think that people will still get hung up on this idea of winning, though, right? That how can I possibly have two goals, the character formation and winning? Because it really does seem like that in order to win, you might have to do some things that aren't virtuous. You might have to be a little selfish. You might have to be a little aggressive. And sometimes maybe that is a good thing to do within that context. But then it becomes difficult. How do you separate? Like, okay, you can do that on the field, but you can't do that here. So how would you speak to that sometimes what it takes to win might actually be some vicious behavior?
Well, I think I'd take it outside of sports for a second. What would that look like telling a surgeon that you may have to cut some corners? You've gotten consent from the patient. This is not what they've asked to do, that you're going to misrepresent their voice and maybe lie to them, that seems to be problematic in that realm. How would it be any different in sports? And so I think we want an approach where there's an organization called Positive Coaching Alliance. It's a very practical resource, and that they put the two together by saying we want to be double goal parents in sports, double goal coaches in sports, double goal athletes, where the objective is to win, right? But it's also to think about the moral lessons that can be translated to other areas of life. And I don't think those have to be mutually exclusive. And so I would push on anyone that says that winning is the primary goal. I'd say, are you willing to cheat? And if they say no, then I say, well, you've just determined that there's something that's more important than winning. And so at some point, whatever we think is right and wrong is going to back up to our own moral reflection and moral standards. And so if it's going against my own personal integrity, that seems to be a problem. Maybe a better way to even frame this, C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity talks about how moral behavior for humans is like a fleet of sailing ships. And he says there's three components to morality in this analogy of the fleet of sailing ships. A fleet of ships needs to know their destination. That's their purpose, their goal, where they're headed, right? And for Christians, that would be analogous to the purpose and meaning that we find from God. They need to know each ship needs to work properly within itself. If it's breaking down, then it's not going to be able to get to its destination if the gears aren't working right. And that would be the personal ethics. And then thirdly, the ships need to work together, cooperate and work in harmony, and that would be the social ethics. And for sports, that's fair play, that's justice, that's playing by the rules of the game.
All right, so Dr. White, this has been really great. I've learned so much, and I feel like you've brought a lot of incredible points and things to think about as we go forward. As parents, as educators, those of us who are involved with any youth in sports, this has been very helpful for us. I want to ask you two parting questions. The first one is, why personally do you care about this so much? Why have you invested so much of your career to faith and character in sport? And then the last thing is, if you could just share with our audience why you think there is hope for sports. So there's a lot of people who think that it's gotten too bad, too morally corrupt, and that it's not going to be a great place to form character. So if you can give us a little why you're doing this, and then give us a little hope for sports.
Great questions. For conclusion, especially. Well, for me, just existentially, I segregated my faith from my sports. As far as the character development. And the way I acted in sports was more like Mr. Hyde sometimes. I mean, I did some stuff that I'm not happy about, and I regret, because I didn't have a deeper understanding of what it means to live well and to flourish. And that should always be in a way that supports and helps other people. And it was more selfish. There's this new Nike ad that came out for the 2024 Olympics, and it has Willem Dafoe, and he's the Green Goblin, if you remember from Spider-Man, and he lists all these statements about what's required to win, essentially, and he separates winning from good moral character. And I get it. It's Nike, it's gritty, it's edgy, it's tongue-in-cheek, but there's a modicum of truth of what they're trying to communicate. The Nike CMO, the Chief Marketing Officer, made a claim that he wanted to have in this ad the characteristics of what it takes to win, and winning is okay. And I would agree, of course winning is okay. But if it's at the expense of the dignity and the well-being of the individual athlete or other athletes, that's not good. And that's what was happening in my life. So I'm passionate to give back to sports, to help Christians especially to know how to put together faith in sports in a way that's consistent to their Christian convictions and character. And then the second question you asked, parting, just kind of hope. I think what God calls us to do is to be faithful witnesses wherever we find ourselves, and trust that God's Spirit is making all things new. And so even though at times it seems like things are getting worse, and in many ways they are, we recognize that God has called us to participate in this transformation here on earth. And that gives me hope, because I know ultimately things will be renewed and restored. And so even if we just give little instances and little tokens and little glimpses of that, then we're being faithful to our calling as Christians.
That's a good parting word. I appreciate that. And thank you so much for your time, Dr. White. This has been very wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson.